So tonight I want to talk again about protection. So we think of the cultivation of wisdom and the cultivation of compassion as separate things. And of course, they are different practices. But because we get stuck in that duality, we lose sight of and lose touch with how closely intertwined they are. There's a really famous sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya called the Sedaka Sutta. And it's about an acrobat and his apprentice. I mean, that's the story that frames the sutta. And the basic story is there's an acrobat and his apprentice. And the acrobat says to his young apprentice, "You protect me and I'll protect you. And together we'll climb the bamboo pole and get our prize." And the young apprentice says, "I'll protect myself. You protect yourself. Together we'll climb the bamboo pole and get the prize." I had read this sutta before I went to Burma. This is actually an aside. But I never really understood it until I got to Burma and saw on festival days in the village, there are these huge bamboo poles. They're quite big diameter, about that big around, and they grease them. They cover them with some kind of oil or something. And they put something really valuable on the top of the pole. And teams of athletic young men climb on top of each other and help each other trying to get to the top of the pole. It doesn't happen very often because it's really hard. It's quite something to watch. So this story from the time of the Buddha is, still playing out now, of people climbing bamboo poles trying to get stuff. That's just an aside. And this story got back to the Buddha, and he kind of wove a whole sutta around it. And here's a small piece of it, just a short quote. "And how is it that by protecting oneself, one protects others? By the development of mindfulness. That's how, by protecting oneself, one protects others. And how is it that by protecting others, one protects oneself? By patience, harmlessness, loving kindness, and sympathy. It's in this way that by protecting others, one protects oneself." That's the literal translation, the list of qualities. The commentaries basically say it means patience, compassion, loving kindness, and mudita. I really love this sense of interwovenness, of interconnection, and the mirror imaging of this. I thought to talk about this because as I sit in the dining room, there on the wall, kind of where my gaze into space lands, there's that yin-yang on the wall. The circle with... And it's just like that. I mean, these two form a perfect whole. And yet the way they're worded anyway, they seem like opposites. So, by protecting oneself through mindfulness, one protects others. Pragmatically and practically, we all know how this works. We protect our health so that the health of others around us won't be harmed. We protect our safety when we drive a car so that we don't collide with anybody, and so everybody around us is safe too. This is, it's simple common sense. It's not anything new to anyone. A little more deeply, there's the moral and ethical aspect of this protection. If we indulge harmful thoughts and let them out by way of action and speech, that overwhelms any of the good we've already cultivated. And the harm to others can be direct or indirect. And I think the indirect aspect of this is really important because we don't often think about it. If we lose our mindfulness and indulge in hateful speech or action, that can spread like a virus. And it gives other people the permission, the tacit permission to do that because we're doing it. Or perhaps our hateful speech and action or just annoyed speech and action. It doesn't have to be hatred. Perhaps that provokes other people to send it back. So by protecting ourselves with mindfulness, that doesn't happen. It stops right here. And one thing the metta practice shows us is just how much in relationship annoyance can really be there, even though we try to pretend it's not around. But if we're mindful of that, we're in charge rather than the dosa taking over. I was reflecting about this, and I had a memory arise of a seriously unwholesome moment that I had had one time while I was walking a Camino. And it was a perfect example of how when one protects oneself with mindfulness, that keeps other people safe. I was walking along, minding my own business, quite happily, and coming towards me at an astonishing rate of speed was a mountain biker, actually more than one. And this was not a wide path. It was a very narrow walking path with, nowhere to go except right down the middle. And these guys just kept coming. They weren't slowing down. They weren't going to get out of the way. It was as if I didn't exist. I missed to be mindful of the fear, but I was aware of the anger. What alerted it to me was the thought of, I just feel like pushing those guys over. And it was a physical feeling. I wanted to just go, boom. Such a harmless nun. It was so shocking. Yeah. And honestly, I really wanted to do it. But I was mindful of that, and I just, as much as I could into the bushes, I got to the side. Saved by mindfulness. So by protecting oneself with mindfulness, one doesn't do stuff like that. Somebody later told me, this was a cyclist, later told me, he had stopped at a water fountain to fill up his water bottle, got off his bike and went over to fill his bottle, and a walking pilgrim who had some bad interaction with the bike went over and started beating on his bike. So, protected by mindfulness or not, we do choose. And this protection applies on not just that kind of superficial, gross level, but as you have seen, quite in a focused way by protecting our practice. So, as you know by now already, etam satim aditya, one should maintain this mindfulness. One connects with mindfulness, and that is what generates the momentum of the metta practice. And you have all seen how this plays out in your metta practice. All those moments when the mind slides off into something, and you could indulge that, whatever it is, or not. That irritation, that doubt, that craving, whatever it is. And in that moment, protected by mindfulness, the mind has wandered into fantasy. Well, happy and peaceful. Coming back. That's protection by mindfulness. So whatever level we're talking about, whether it be that very refined level of the practice or the more gross level of our daily life, that protection by sati, by awareness, is quite important. And when we go out into the world, we have to do both of those things. Paying attention at a very refined level, but also noticing the more gross movements of speech and action. So broadly, as regards our life in the world, both these levels, the refined and the gross, are essential. All this week you have been cultivating metta in thought, metta in the mind and the heart. That's the refined level. Noticing these tiny movements of the mind and deciding in that moment if we are mindful and protected by mindfulness to go one way or the other. But metta does not only, and the cultivation of metta does not only play out in the mind. There's metta in speech and metta in action. That's, whether to push the bicyclist over or not. And because all the trouble in the world comes from the mind, what we do here is really essential. But protecting ourselves with mindfulness, thus protecting others, as it plays out in speech and action, this is a huge practice. We might not be so aware when things are going quickly in regular life of the very refined movements of the mind that create impulses to speak and act. But you can watch that desire, for example, to speak, and it can be sometimes very, very clear. When you're in the middle of a conversation with one or more people, especially if it's like 2 or 3 people and everybody's taking turns to speak, there can be this real desire to add to the conversation, but maybe there's not a break. And so there's this kind of feeling of wanting to talk. And it's really interesting to watch that, because sometimes what we want to say is useful and sometimes it's not. So we can use that desire to speak, which is actually sometimes it feels physical, it's quite obvious, as a little mindfulness bell. Do I say this or not? That's a choice point where mindfulness can be very protective. So by protecting ourselves with mindfulness, we protect others. And this really, as the Satipatthana practice deepens, this gives us the protection of wisdom. Anybody who's ever met a really seriously developed being understands what a force for goodness they are in the world, and how careful they are with their speech and with their action. That's protecting ourselves with mindfulness. And often in the context of a Vipassana retreat, this is where the discussion ends. You don't hear about the metta part, the other part, the complementary part. So by protecting others, one protects oneself. That necessary complement to the wisdom piece, that complement of patience, loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy. Patience, metta, karuna, mudita. Nyanaponika has a lovely way of saying this. He said, a patient, compassionate heart is a refuge for the whole world. Love that. And that protection of others that is rooted in patience and these 3 of the 4 Brahmaviharas excludes selfishness. When we are patient, when metta is present, when compassion is present, when mudita is present, by definition, there's no selfishness there. And this protects the whole world, starting with the others around us, from our worst impulses. There's a really beautiful and very inspiring example of this in the suttas. In the Majjhima Nikaya, there's a sutta called the Chula Gosanga Sutta. And the Gosinga wood, this forest, was a place where the monks often went to practice and abide. They lived there. And so at one point, Anuruddha, who was one of the Buddha's chief disciples, and 2 of his friends were living together there. They had made friends with the gatekeeper of the wood, of the forest. So one day the Buddha came by and the gatekeeper went out, so, "No, sir, please don't come in. There are these venerable ones here practicing. I don't want anybody to disturb them." It's actually very sweet. It's like, no. And it's the Buddha waiting there, right? So Anuruddha happened to be nearby and heard this, and he came out and he said, no, don't worry, this is our teacher. He can come in. And so the Buddha came and basically, polite, just caring conversation. How are you? How are you all living here? How are you doing? And Anuruddha tells the Buddha, he says, we're living in concord, with mutual appreciation, without dispute, blending like milk and water, and viewing each other with kindly eyes. We're different in body, but one in mind. And the Buddha says, how do you do that? And the backstory, of course, is the Buddha had also dealt with monks who were almost coming to blows, that weren't doing this. The first thing Anuruddha says, he says, we reflect about what a wonderful benefit it is to have such companions in the holy life. And this is such a manifestation of metta, when we see the good in each other and appreciate each other. And then he gets to the core of what they do. It's very, very interesting. He says, we maintain bodily acts, verbal acts, and mental acts of loving kindness towards each other. In other words, metta in deed, speech, and thought. Here's the part that made me open my eyes. He said, both openly and privately. Imagine if the world did that. And it's one thing to practice metta in deed, speech, and thought openly in front of other people. But having the integrity to do that privately as well is quite something. Because when we reflect on our own behavior, we can sometimes notice a difference. And it may not be a huge difference, but maybe we've been really nice to somebody, mostly to be polite. And then when we get into a private conversation about them to somebody else, we say, oh, that person really bugs me. A friend of mine who is an American citizen, but her mother is British, she said she grew up with this disparity where they'd have visitors and her mother would, be saying goodbye to them. Oh, thank you so much for coming. Do come again. The door would close and she'd say, oh, thank God they're gone. I mean, we laugh at this because we recognize it in ourselves, to be honest. I watch myself at the monastery, and I know I'm not the only one. In public, you bow to somebody, you are very respectful for them, and, you say nice things to them, and you get in private with somebody and say, oh, that monk, I just cannot respect him. Or whatever it is, something bothers you and you're venting to somebody behind that person's back. So protecting others by metta in deed, speech, and thought all the time. And it's easy to see how that protects us because we have integrity and people can trust us. And then Anuruddha went on to speak of flexibility and about how each of them in their own way would reflect when two of the other two would want to do something and they would want to do something different. It's like, well, they want to do that. Why don't we all just do that? It's okay. So letting go of preferences is also a form of patient kindness. We think of others. We think of ourselves, we take care of ourselves, but we also think of others, both. And I find this story so inspiring. And yes, it's an ideal. It's not something that, is very familiar in this world. All three of them were very highly developed beings. And we might read that story and go, never mind, I can't do that. Or it's not practical in this world, or something, some negative, cynical comment that might arise. But if all we did was to take this part about metta in deed, speech, and thought, openly and privately, if we took that on as a practice, think of how it would transform the world around us. Protecting ourselves, protecting others, mindfulness, metta, both back and forth. And this beautiful synergy is in part because right self-protection is the expression of wisdom. Right self-protection in the sense of samma, like right speech, right action. Right. Self-protection is the expression of wisdom, and protection of others is the expression of compassion. And the Dhamma develops this, or needs to develop this in a balanced way, both of these together. And when they're developed in a harmonious and balanced way together, they're like the wings of a bird. A bird needs two wings to fly, it's often said in the texts. One wing is compassion, the other wing is wisdom. And this honest, gentle kindness that we have been developing here, that knows pain, really it allows us to touch the soft spot in the heart that we usually protect. There's so much strength in this. We don't hide from ourselves when metta is present, and we can do this. We don't pretend. It's like, this is here. Oh, whew. We just feel it kindly. And this is what allows wisdom to grow.
And
Because we can see things as they are. This not clinging to that ego that is protective. This is so deeply supportive of the development of insight. Wisdom arises when we let go. Everybody knows this. And that back door of wisdom that we see in this metta practice comes from letting go of that false sense of protection that the ego offers. When we're no longer clinging so tightly to ourselves and what we want and all of that, and we begin to let the world in, the more non-clinging there is, the more wisdom there is. The more wisdom there is, the more metta there can be. Metta, wisdom, metta, wisdom. You can see where this leads. It's a positive feedback loop. So protecting others with the metta practice, we protect ourselves with wisdom. And, of course, vice versa, the opposite. So if we're doing satipatthana practice, vipassana practice, the more wisdom there is, naturally the more metta there is. The more metta, the more wisdom, the more, they just directly feed each other. They support each other and lift each other up. So we see, I promised I'd get to the last verse of this Metta Sutta. So most of the first 3 verses are Sila, and then 6.5 verses of Samadhi. And finally at the very end, 1 little verse, which is wisdom. Very condensed. I really love that first line, by not falling into mistaken views. There's so many levels of mistaken views, but a lot of what is meant there is mistaken views about ego. I need, I want. If you're like that to me, then I'm not going to like you. All those protective, worldly, ego-based things that we do that are not metta. I don't have to give examples, we all know them. But through the purification of the practice, these become more and more and more attenuated until there's this boundlessness of metta. And this is that back door into anatta that people experience so much in this practice. That back door into the experience of there is not a separate self here. It manifests in various ways in the practice, but one way it manifests is when the metta is strong and continuous. People often have this experience of, and expressed as, there was nobody sending and receiving anymore. There was just metta and beings in it. Or losing that sense of, I am sending metta to them. It's just like there's just metta being sent. So without falling into those views of ego, endowed with insight and integrity, guiding away greed for sensual things. Think of Anuruddha and his buddies there in the Gosinga wood. With their integrity of metta in deed, speech, and thought, openly and privately, and clearly seeing each other, being different in body but one in mind. This is, the insight actually into emptiness. And literally that last line, one would not be born again into a womb. There are many ways of interpreting that line. Some people consider it a reference to being a sotapanna. Some people take it to mean when one attains a certain level of jhana with metta, one is not reborn in a physical body. Either way, it's seriously good. Yeah, I'm very pragmatic. I'll take either or both. This is where this goes. Protecting ourselves, we protect others. Protecting others, we protect ourselves. And we all lift each other up. This, I think, is the true meaning of Sangha. Living together like this is really rare and precious. Like milk and water, blending like milk and water. And yeah, we're human beings. Yeah, we bug each other sometimes. Yes, we make mistakes. We're not yet Anuruddha and his buddies, but by this protection, we'll get there. So thank you for your kind attention, everybody. Let's sit together and let the words settle.